welcome or welcome back to another episode of Ask a Speechy, where we invite professional, successful people and experts to talk about dyslexia. And we ask them your question. You can simply visit our website at dystech.com.au/askaspeechy, submit your question, and we will make sure to include them in our next episode. I am really excited for today's guest. Shaped by the challenges associated with his own dyslexia, and after struggling through the traditional secondary education system, Dean Bragonier became a diligent and successful college student who developed a true love of learning at Bates College. He is now a successful social entrepreneur, and he is the founder and executive dyslexic of Notice Ability, a non-for-profit organization dedicated to helping students with dyslexia to identify their unique strengths and build their self-esteem. He's also a big voice for the dyslexic community with a famous and inspiring TED Talk, as well as multiple speeches where he talks and raises awareness about dyslexia and education. Dean, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Oh, I'm generally speaking, I'm fine. I'm healthy. My family's healthy. During this time in history, that is the most important thing. I suppose it's the most important thing at any point, but especially now. It's a tough time, obviously, for all of us globally. I have to believe that we as a global society are going to come out of this with a greater level of empathy for each other, a greater understanding how we all fit into this larger social fabric, and hopefully some of the indulgent entitlement of our communities can sort of take the backseat to just empathy and understanding. But
that's good to hear.
One thing before we start, though, you had this very generous introduction, which I appreciated, but there was one caveat that I have to contest, which was that, yes, I became a diligent student at Bates College, but when I was studying at the University of Melbourne,
wow,
not so diligent. Something Aussies over at Trinity College, man, they wanted to take down this Yank at every opportunity. So we spent very little time studying, and shall I say, I learned a lot about recreational Australian culture, if you know what I mean.
All right.
Yeah. So,
absolutely. Well, that's good to know. That's a good, I'm sure people will really enjoy that, knowing that you've been around here. And it's good to hear that, you're optimistic and certainly, let's hope that, we come out stronger out of this crisis, and good to hear that everything is okay on your side. And, talking about personal story, tell us when were you diagnosed with dyslexia?
Sure. I was very fortunate. I was very, very fortunate for a 1970s child, and even by today's standards. I was diagnosed when what we call third grade, which is probably around 7, 8 years old, and that was a really aggressive timeline for then, and certainly it is still today. That early diagnosis was a sort of a perfect storm of good factors. The first one being my mother, who is a child developmental psychologist, my father, who is diagnosed dyslexic, and that level of awareness at home, coupled with sufficient resources to get me a test, to then get me the reading remediation that I needed. And, for a majority of people, they're lucky if they have one, if not two, let alone three of those factors. So I'm very, very lucky in that regard.
Right. That's true that, there's other terrible story about, people not being lucky enough to actually be diagnosed throughout their whole, life. And sometimes they just, wake up as an adult, 40 plus years old, and turns out that they learn that they have have dyslexia, and I'm actually a little bit the same. I've been diagnosed around 10, 11, so I think I was lucky as well. And so, did when so you've been diagnosed and you were quite young, so I guess did this had an impact on you, like knowing that you've been diagnosed with a learning difference, in your early years? Did this had an impact on your life, throughout school and education with your friends and things like this?
Yeah. Yeah. It did. It did have an impact, and it didn't, knowing that I was dyslexic didn't save me from the ramifications, emotionally and psychologically, of believing that I was broken and stupid. However, the one benefit that it did give me was an idea of why it was that I was struggling, so that I was able to create just enough of a buffer, to allow myself to to believe a little tiny kernel of truth that, this was a challenge that presented in certain subject matters. It was certain skills like the acquisition of reading and spelling and the written word, and that I could compartmentalize my struggle in that regard. But that buffer, again, the buffer was so narrow. But I think that I have to attribute to the fact that I had that buffer is probably the reason why I wasn't completely, destroyed by this false narrative that I was broken. I think that I speak with a lot of adult dyslexics who didn't find out until their children were getting diagnosed. And at that moment, they described this weight being lifted that they didn't even know really existed. Right now, all of a sudden,
Mm,
explanation as to why it is that they have always struggled. And my heart goes out to them, because at least I had a a a biological explanation. I had a title, a label to hang it on. And a lot of people will also say, well, is labeling kids a good thing or is it a bad thing? And I'm like,
mm,
to be able to externalize your explanation of why you're struggling, in my mind, is a heck of a lot more healthy than believing that all of me is broken. I can simply say
mm.
part of me was not genetically engineered to acquire the official medium of communication, which is the written word. And that's
Right.
an easier understanding to digest. So I think labels are terrific, in when it comes to dyslexia. Labels in other ways, that's a totally different conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I actually I have a bit of a different story, because I've been diagnosed, and then that's it. My life was just back to normal. So I was never labeled throughout my education life. I went to school, and I was just a normal guy who was just terrible at school and missing class a lot. But and then when we started a couple of years ago, what we're doing now, I started going to this conference, listening to those experts and speech pathologists, educational psychologists, and they were like literally describing me. I'm like, oh my god, this is. So I can definitely understand the moment of this sort of weight that is sort of lifted in terms of being able to pinpoint what's going on and like point it to somewhere. And so you've been doing some amazing work, and I'd like your thought on something. So for your generation, I would assume that support for dyslexic were just non-existent, right? It was quite terrible to be in school for your generation. But now, we've evolved. We've got internet, technology, social media, all that sort of things. But still, obviously, there's still some issue that we can improve on. And so, in your view, what's the biggest problem that you see in society for dyslexic right now in 2020?
How long do we have? But So, it's interesting because I just was going to circle back to that statement that I made about labels and saying that, that I should have inserted a caveat that a label for the student themselves, I think, is a very, very powerful explanation. The label, though, can cut both ways insofar as, to answer your question, how schools perceive the student with dyslexia. Now, if you have in an educational institution, a private school, a public school, a homeschooling environment, where there is a greater understanding, the full picture of what a dyslexic struggles with and what attributes they have as a result of their dyslexia, then that label is going to both level the playing field in terms of the challenges and open the doors of opportunities when it comes to these advantages that we have. So in that sense, a label is really useful in an educational context. The flip side of that, and unfortunately this is the case for most of the public education in the United States, is that the understanding of dyslexia is often non-existent, and if it is perceived only as a deficiency. And so I have worked with really well-intentioned special educators in public school environments in the United States where I come in and I say, okay, great. So did everybody do that work in preparation for this class? And the teacher will turn to me and say, oh, they're dyslexic. They don't do homework. And I'm like, wow, I see the compassion. You're trying to be empathetic and set expectations. But I know that these kids are so smart that when you put these low expectations on them, what are they going to do? Voluntarily exceed your expectations? No, it's school. They're going to meet your low expectations and they're going to call it a day. So they're going to, how schools and educators perceive dyslexia can either, in the worst case scenario, say, dyslexia, what is that? Get back to your desk and read out loud. Or second worst case scenario is, oh, you poor dyslexic. Oh, it's okay. I'm just going to give you the grade so you can go on to the next grade and continue on your education. You won't get an education, but you'll graduate. And then the best case scenario is, oh, you're dyslexic. Fantastic. We know you've got some great things to bring to the table. We also know you got some challenges. And we, getting back to your question, have some technological accommodations that we're going to give you that are going to allow you to be the best student you can be in our institution. So I think your original question, and I've hijacked the entire answer, but you said was, how does technology play in?
It was, yeah, we'll certainly have this in the loop, but I thought I was more thinking of on the bigger picture where, in your view, if you could pinpoint to, like, there's multiple problem with dyslexia or things that we can improve, but what would be the biggest one in your opinion? And so far, I mean, it seems that you're highlighting awareness, right? Or the people on the field, on the front line of education, which are teacher and school, they're the one making the future citizen of our society. And so it seems that those people seems to lack this, the things that you're describing, which is, being able to empower dyslexic student, right? And so am I right by saying that awareness might be actually one of the biggest problems that we have? Maybe, there may be bigger problem, but at least one of the biggest today. Is that right?
Yeah, and now I remember why I hijacked your question, was because it was such an enormous one. So I probably I was trying to think. No, I think you can distill it to really kind of three things. The first and foremost is detection, screening, like what you all do, a diagnosis in the best case scenario, but recognizing a child early is not only essential for their own personal understanding and their trajectory through school, but also we know on a neuroscientific level that the neuroplasticity of the brain when you are young enables the dyslexic learner, if they are taught correctly, they can acquire the skill of reading. So that early
Mm.
detection is absolutely a necessary component that unfortunately is lacking in most places. The second thing on top of that is, okay, everybody who is dyslexic gets diagnosed. Terrific. Well, it doesn't mean anything if educators in the classroom don't understand what dyslexia is, how to address it from a reading remediation perspective, or more importantly, as importantly, in my opinion, how to foster the emotional and psychological development of the child when they go through the academic process. So basically, the problem is the lacking of that trifecta of early detection, proper reading remediation and instruction, and then lastly, the awareness of the nuances of dyslexia, both the challenges as well as the attributes, so that we can foster a classroom that is going to engender self-esteem plus capacity and produce an empowered human being. And you're right. I mean, your answer was absolutely accurate, which is that awareness is the precursor to all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's actually, I'm sort of like, it make me feel good that to hear this, because when we first started this project of building a technology that can screen, we were faced with what are the big problem that if solved, then dyslexia is not a problem anymore, right? And we actually narrow it down to two things, but the third one is actually, I think, under the second one. And for us was like, well, we first need to know, and then we first need to act. So it's basically, we know it's dyslexia. How can we make sure we know as fast as possible? And then, so what? What do we do about it? And it seems that, if we solve this equation, it seems that we'll be in a much better position. And so, talking about dyslexia and all those different things that happen right now with technology and all that sort of thing, maybe you can tell us, like, as a dyslexic, what help you during the day? Do you use any tech? Is there any tips and tricks that you use to be able to go on with your day and at work?
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know exactly who's going to listen to this. Your audience, and I am always trying to look out for our dyslexic siblings, right? The 7th, 8th, 9-year-olds who are struggling. And in addition to the three things that we just spoke about, that detection, that et cetera, how do I get through the day? And unfortunately, it's one of the hardest things for a dyslexic to learn. And that, in my opinion, this is going from not the student, but to the professional level, or better yet, this applies to sort of the middle, high school, collegiate, and professional realm, is that our brains have something called working memory, right? Which is that you think of it as this tool bench, essentially in the brain, where all the stimulus from the outside world comes into our brain, and we work on that content, and then it drops down into either short-term or long-term memory, or gets dispelled. What we know is that dyslexics have an inherently reduced working memory compared to the neurotypical, which means that when all of this stimulus comes down in terms of decoding and going through endless emails or texts, or the stuff that I have to do on a daily basis, that workbench gets filled. I can't take in additional content because just the mechanics of decoding all of the content is what I focus on. So there's this panacea, which is executive functioning, right? Which is a highbrow way of saying that we need to know how to organize our lives. And then furthermore, we have to delineate between what information is relevant, what information we can afford to let above, and what is really paramount to addressing. And For me, I started to develop that certainly in high school and in college, but it wasn't until I got into the workplace that I really perfected the art of executive function.
Mm.
And the way I did it is really not something I recommend. I had graduated from college with a philosophy of religion degree, which didn't qualify me for any job that I could think of. But so what I did is I decided to purchase a restaurant. I'm not really sure why. I just bought this little struggling restaurant because I wanted to teach myself business. And I mean, honestly, I could not have made a cup of coffee before I bought this restaurant. So it was not the best decision. But very quickly, I realized that if I was going to succeed in this very hostile business, I needed to take on some of the essential, most expensive roles in the operation, which was at the time being a line cook and being the general manager, right? Which meant that if I was in my breakfast operation, right, and follow me on this, I will get to a point, I promise you. I've got a bunch of tickets for an order right up ahead of me. Let's say 8 or 10 of them, right? And I see the one, and I see a couple of tickets down the row. And I say, okay, this person needs fried eggs with a side of hash browns, an English muffin, toasted lightly with jam. That process needs to go into my brain, okay? Boom, that gets imprinted in my brain. Then physically, I have to crack those eggs. I have to put that English muffin in, right? While simultaneously entertaining a comment of a buddy who drops by. Hey, thanks a lot for breakfast. Hey, bud, no problem. Hey, let's go fishing later. Cool, cool. Remembering the fact that the English muffin has gone into the toaster and has a finite period of time. So that stopwatch is now running for the English muffin, right? But don't forget, Hugo, the eggs are cooking, right? They wanted those fried, not scrambled, not fried hard. They wanted them fried medium. So the timer is still going on the eggs. At that point, you flip, but of course, the delivery of the vegetables comes in. The delivery guy goes, where do I put these vegetables? I go, hey, listen, I want you to put them over here. But remember, don't forget that toast, Hugo. But the eggs are, so I won't go into this. On and on and on. What happens is that for literally 12 hours a day, my brain was forced to think in this hierarchy of time sequences. And it was physically, I could feel my brain like going through, like, when the human being turns into the Hulk, like I could feel it manipulating, and it's really painful when the Hulk turns into the Hulk. I hope that's an Australian relevant analogy, but it was the most painful thing. But all of a sudden, what I started to do was realize that I could start all these little tiny timers in my brain and be aware of all the timers, and then start to sequence my level of execution according to those timers. So now, as an adult, let me ask you, do you know a show called The Price is Right?
No, I don't.
Okay, it's a bummer. It's a bummer. For anybody that's interested, I'll just give it a teaser. The Price is Right. Something called the Showcase Showdown. It's a big wheel where they turn. They have to get up to $1. It's got all these little, 10 cents, 7 cents, and they spin it.
Yeah.
And goes, what my brain turned to was the Showcase Showdown wheel, where everything gets put onto that wheel, perpetually spinning. And if I can address it, I address it and I take it off and I put something else on the wheel. But it's always going. If I can't, I know it's going to go on the wheel and come back. So this executive functioning, and when I said I'm looking out for our little dyslexic siblings, it's a really, really difficult thing to learn. And and there are easier ways to do it than buying a restaurant. But I'm doing it with my son, who is a dyslexic, right? I'm dyslexic. My wife's dyslexic. He is genetically a perfect dyslexic. I'm constantly drilling in this executive functioning, because if you can master executive functioning and be a dyslexic, you have literally conquered the two extremes of the mental spectrum. You can think enormously big picture, and you can execute on a minute detail level, and you can toggle between. And if you can do this, look, you're dyslexic with entrepreneur with dyslexia. You do this on a basis. So
Yeah.
as much as I could say, well, here's my secret for answering emails, here's my secret for dealing with time sequencing, I'm giving you a macro understanding of how you can then apply that worldview to whatever response
Mm.
you have. And if you can master those two things, then the world's your oyster.
Mm. That's
You can do whatever the heck you want because you can toggle between those extremes. But it is painful. And as a parent or a teacher, it is equally painful to teach. And as a dyslexic, I mean, you can answer that. You went through that process at some point?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great approach to that question actually. So it's basically train your brain, and it's fascinating. I have a good friend of mine, and often, sometimes we like to we just have discussion, and those discussions sometimes can go for a long time and can get very boring for people listening. But we talk about sometimes very deep stuff, and then last time we were discussing about the brain and how anything you do in life that you take for granted is in reality highly, highly, highly complicated. And you simply take driving, right? You take driving, you get in your car, you're not thinking about anything. You can take your car, drive, have a conversation with someone sitting next to you, look at this, listen to some music, and maybe check your phone, and you shouldn't. And if you segment everything that needs to happen for you to be able to do this in terms of movement, coordination, distance measurement, awareness of risk, these whole crazy things, and you sort of drill through the details, you kind of get into some crazy place, right? And so when you talk to neuro scientists, that's what keep them up at night. It's like, what the hell is going on? Right? This is insane. And and it's actually the same with reading, right? When you say, hang on a minute, right, you can read this, but in reality, if you start drilling down, the amount of things that your brain needs to be able to do is quite insane. Your answer to this is really cool, because it's like practice. Like there's no other way.
Yeah.
And that's a great, I guess that's a great advice, is just we had another guest on the podcast. He's a school psychologist, and he said something that I really like. He said, give praise to the attempt, right? Because if you try, regardless of success or failure, you're actually learning to try, and that's a good mechanism to have to do stuff and be better, and improve different aspect of your life, or your capacity, cognitive capacity, or things like this. And so on this point,
Well, I got to interrupt you there because we're riffing off this right now. Now I got to respond to that because that's brilliant.
okay, let's go.
I say that I've reached my lifetime quota on alcohol, but nonetheless, I speculate that you and I need to go over to Naughton's pub, and I will drink water, and you drink some VB, and I think that we would have a very long conversation right now about this sort of thing. But I know your audience doesn't have that sort of time. What you just touched upon is the phenomenon of automation. Right? You have, when you talk about that driving, right, you have automized that process in your brain so that it doesn't require space on that working memory tool bench, right? And as a result, you're able to insert conversation, listening to music, definitely not texting, even if you do, but that sort of thing, right? You're able to free up that time. The other thing that you touched upon, which is the school psychologist, is, praising effort. Here in the United States, we have Silicon Valley, right? This is where the titans of disruption reside and make tons of cash. The idea is that, the most valuable street credibility in Silicon Valley is not how many wins you've had, but how many failures you've had, right? Then when you walk into a pitch meeting, people know that you know what it's like to try and accept defeat and try again, right? So that goes back to the dyslexic narrative. But the last thing I was saying, for anybody listening, there is a gentleman named, dyslexics have a tough time with word retrieval, Seligman. I'm not going to spell it. Seligman. He was the person that discovered and postulated the theory of learned helplessness. Well, he has since spent the last 30 years talking about learned optimism, which goes back to the discussion about what your school psychologist said. And Seligman has produced a book that gives you anecdotal as well as evidence-based instruction on how to engender learned optimism within your child or your student. Turns out that optimism is not an innate part of our personalities, but is actually a learned behavior, and that you
Oh,
can
wow.
learned optimism, which is really critical for students with dyslexia, because Lord knows in early education, they're going to experience a lot of defeat.
Mm.
Again, I digress, but again, a shout out to Naughton's Pub. That's where we would have to continue that discussion, but we'll table that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's there's so much interesting things, and the brain is really, really, really fascinating. You know, it's just like the universe, right? We don't really know what's going on, but we try and learn as much as we can. Dean, how would you explain dyslexia to someone who never heard of it? Right? Like that person never heard of dyslexia. They don't even know what that means. They don't even know the terminology of the word, like dyslexia. You know, sometimes you could have some background knowledge of this, of what it might mean. Let's assume that person doesn't know anything. What would you tell them?
I'd say this. The way we're communicating right now through the spoken language is an invisible medium of communication. I speak, you hear it, you process it, you understand what I'm saying, you reply. That is an ingrained ability that we are born with, every single one of us, with the exception of a couple. But generally speaking, human beings are born with that capacity. It needs to be learned and matured from infanthood into early childhood. The process of taking that invisible medium and making it visible is a man-made invention. I am going to agree with you that if I draw a letter like this, that squiggly line is going to represent a D, and it's going to sound like duh. And if I write a little letter that goes like this and another one like that, it will say Dean. So now we've made the invisible visible because we've agreed on these squiggly lines. The dyslexic brain, nobody knows why, has a fundamental disconnect between the visual observation of those squiggly words and the language translation component, so that there is this missing of this synchronicity that works pretty well for a vast majority of human beings. They can get the brain to use these different parts to acquire the skill of processing that visual into a knowledge of the spoken, and they can proceed. For us as dyslexics, that synchronicity of those different brain components just doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't come to us naturally. And as a result, unless it's taught to us in a very, very specific way, which has existed since the 1960s, if we're not taught that, that synchronicity never happens. And as a result, as the brain becomes more concrete in its wiring with age, the more and more difficult it becomes for us to externally get information and instruction that will allow that synchronicity to happen. So there's a fundamental disconnect between the visual and the language part of the brain, because reading is a man-made invention. It is an acquired skill as a result. That may be...
That's great. You know, that make me think, I don't know if you've seen, but there is some video, I think it's a YouTube channel or something, where they get an expert in any field and they tell them to explain a very complicated concept to different level, to a 10-year-old kid, to a college student, and then to a professor. And that's great. I think this is actually a great simple explanation with simple word. That's important, because you can get lost into the word that are being used if you go into the science of it. I wanna talk about notice ability. And actually, maybe you can talk much better than me about it. What is the work that you do, and what does your organization do? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. No, I'd love to. I'd love to. And what I should have said at the very beginning of the is I should have prefaced with a caveat of what I am not. I am not a neuroscientist. I am not a researcher. I'm not a child developmental psychologist. I'm a Bachelor of Arts with a philosophy of religion. What I am really well versed in is being dyslexic, and being the husband of a dyslexic, and being the father of a dyslexic, and being the son of a dyslexic. So I've got like 100 years worth of experience in the field, right? So all I'm bringing, and that said, when my wife gave birth to our son, we knew that he would be dyslexic. I mean, the percentage of having two dyslexic parents and the offspring being dyslexic is hovers around 80+%, right? So we knew he was dyslexic. We didn't need the piece of paper, although we had to get it just to prove to the outside world. What I saw at that moment, and I don't know if you're a father, but your whole world changes. You enter a new paradigm where you recognize that your existence is no longer the center of the universe, but your child is. And I cold sweat moment knowing that while he will be able to harness the attributes of dyslexia later in life, he has to go through 18 years worth of education in order to get to that point. And how is he going to survive that? And as we spoke about earlier today, we'll get him the diagnosis, we'll get him the reading remediation, but what existed at that time, there was no solution to address the self-confidence that was going to get beat up and kicked around during that process. And so knowing what I knew from being a dyslexic in a working professional at that time, and understanding that the attributes of dyslexia later in life far outweigh the struggles early in life, I needed to somehow convey to my son that he had that reality to look forward to. And so I thought to myself, how can I create a lifeline for my son? And what occurred to me was information that I read in a book called The Dyslexic Advantage, written by Dr. Brock and Fernette Eide, two neuroscientists. And they had so beautifully spelled out this portfolio of dyslexic cognitive attributes that we as a population seem to have. And furthermore, which professions those dyslexics tended to resonate towards and succeed in. And the light bulb went off for me. I said, okay, if we can combine these cognitive assets, introduce these cognitive assets to students who are struggling, maybe what we call middle school, 10, 12, 13, 14 years old. If we can introduce them to these cognitive attributes, they will likely be at the least bit intrigued, at the most fascinated. And then what we simultaneously can do is introduce them in the context of those professions where likely they have an inherent interest because of these cognitive advantages. And then once we can bring in these disenfranchised learners, we can teach them what is called social emotional learning, which is a new trend in education, which is that we need to understand how we function as individuals, how we can contribute to group environments, how we can regulate our emotional behavior in those types of groups and situations, and how we can be our best selves, essentially. So on a granular level, that's conflict resolution, that's negotiation, that's active listening. All of these skills as adults need now are starting to percolate in the educational system. So if we can combine these three things, which is a strength-based approach in the context of professions that dyslexics seem to be disproportionately successful in, and then teach those learners social emotional learning, what they can do is they can engender self-confidence, what we call academic tenacity, right? Their willingness to stick with school when it gets tough, which it inevitably will. And then lastly, how they can become aware of the stigma that they may be putting on themselves or that others may be placing upon them. So we created 3 different courses focused on the top 4 professions that we identified, which is entrepreneurship, engineering, architecture, and the arts. And so we combined architecture and engineering. We have an entrepreneurship class and we have an arts-based class. And all of this content of these subject matters is taught by me and other instructors on a online learning platform so that we can teach content to students using different modalities of learning: video, audio, graphic, and pictorial imagery, all of which circumvent the challenge of reading. Not that dyslexics don't need to know how to read, they do, but we need to give them an emotional reprieve from having to dissect the written word in order to get to true information. We need to give them a break, right? So let's use the modalities that you and I are using right now, audio and video. And so we teach all that content. We provide that to students, and then teachers in the classroom facilitate the project-based learning aspect, the practical application. So to give you an example, students will go through our entrepreneurship class. There'll be, let's say a group of 12-year-olds in a public school in, Melbourne or Sydney, right? They will have all of the instruction coming online from us. Then the teacher will say, okay, you guys are going to go out and identify a real world problem that you want to solve. The students then go through a 10-week process of coming up with a unique solution to that problem and building a business plan, and then ultimately a presentation that they make in front of their peers, teachers, parents. And the whole idea is that throughout that process, they're going through exercises that trigger recognition of the cognitive advantages of their dyslexia. And now all of a sudden they're going, wait a minute, you mean I'm better at doing this than most other people? Yeah, you are. They say, I don't believe you. Okay. Don't believe me, except for the fact that 35% of all entrepreneurs in the world are dyslexic. They go, oh, you mean the lemonade stand that I set up? Or when I was selling carrots, I was an entrepreneur. Oh, I get it. So it has to do with my dyslexia. Now, all of a sudden, you're sending these kids a very different message than they've had all their lives. You poor child, you're stupid, you're broken. Now, yes, you struggle with reading, but you're a rock star when it comes to these other things. And what my hope is that when they recognize their true capacity and they're in the midst of the academic storm, I mean, who wants to go through middle school again, right? The most god-awful time of your life, right? You got pimples, things growing in different ways, and everybody is expecting more academically from you. Now, all of a sudden, we're saying to them, there's a reason to stick with this. Because math is relevant to entrepreneurship, right? Math is relevant to engineering and architecture. So show up for math, be ready for math, okay? Or, all of these subject matters that we teach in a vacuum in education, which makes no sense. We expect kids to go through 18, 20, 22 years of education, and then we tell them why it was necessary. Makes no sense. Tell them why they're going to use these things so they have context, and dyslexics desperately need context. I'm going to shut up because I'm so tired of listening to myself speak right now. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. You know,
You just lost
I
half.
had a I had the previous guest that we had. She's an amazing person, and she's writing decodable book for a struggling reader, and she was talking about confidence, and she's got a kid with dyslexia, and she was talking about confidence and things, and what's it's so interesting. Throughout the work that we did, we actually went to a very personal side of dyslexic kid. We actually collected audio recording of dyslexic kid, and we had to listen to every single one of them because we had to make annotation to build the technology. And I did collect a fair amount of data myself. So I had the kid coming around, hey, look at this app, and when we did this by listening, and we still do, we still have to process the identified data that we collect, and you listen to this, there is something so strong, emotionally strong, about the fact that this kid is just not able to do that. But when they come, they're full of joy, and they can do all sorts of different things. They're just like full of life and everything. And then when it comes to this, it's like the worst thing ever. And I truly believe that education is one of the best universal solution we have for any problem, any given problem, whether it's the environment, whether it's politics, whatever you name it. It all starts somewhere, and I think that's education, and I think that self-confidence and being able to make the child notice the ability, or being aware that, hey, I can actually do something. That's just thumbs up, and then that would enable so many child. And talking about noticeability, where can people find you? I think I've got your website on there, where it's noticeability.org. Is that right? Is that where people can reach out and connect with you and your organization?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, thank you for that. And ironically, that the name of the organization is meant to be heard two ways, which is what you've just touched upon, which is, if you notice ability, you see no disability, right? And so luckily we've got both those domains locked up, so it'll still come back to us no matter. But you're absolutely right. We can start to recognize, acknowledge, and articulate our appreciation of the abilities these dyslexics show, they and we will less and less see the disability, right? Eventually no disability. I mean, somebody far smarter and more eloquent than I am said something: it's paramount that we don't let school get in the way of our child's education.
That's interesting.
Now, not to say that all schools get in the way of a child's education. There are thousands of schools, and I work with some of the best that make me so just, I bend the knee to educators, because they go into this profession where they are underappreciated, grotesquely underpaid. They have more demands than a CEO of a big business, and they do so. They want to help children, empower and shape our future, because they are shaping the minds of young kids. But the way our educational system is structured is so antiquated that these wonderful individuals are forced to, at least in the United States and overseas, I would imagine, meet all sorts of demands. Well, did you tick this box? Did the child meet this benchmark? Are rooted, I know, in good intention, but the execution can often be overwhelming and distract an educator from what their intuition says about engaging a child and fostering hope and imagination. And so, yes, going back to where people can find us, yes, our website has got a contact form, but most specifically, it also has links so that people can start to explore what our curriculum looks like. There's, free previews on different things and a ton of explanation on what it would look like to actually implement it in your private school, your public school, your homeschooling environment, as an after-school club, whatever it may be. Our job, as I see it, is to give a tool to educators who want to engage this population in a proactive and perhaps innovative way that makes the obligation of the teacher, excuse me, let me put that differently, that lightens the burden of the teacher, that allows them to reacquaint themselves with the original intention of their profession, which is to enjoy watching children learn organically and supporting them to do so. So I like to say to educators, and I say this in our instructor training, is that their job, it's a whole flipped classroom. We've created it so that when students are working in the in-person component in the classroom, we put them into what's called soul centers, which is an acronym for a self-organized unbridled learning center. Basically, it's the idea is that it's their little startup company, and we know from research that when students believe they're learning autonomously, they tend to retain content at much higher rates. So what we're doing is saying, let's get these kids to work together, and let's also put the educator in a supportive scaffolding position and let these kids finally just be able to verbally riff each other and speak about what they're thinking, much as you do with your mate when you're talking about, driving and talking all these things, right? Dyslexics want to be able to use their voices, as I guess I've
Yes.
during. But what we're trying to say to the educator is, make yourself sit in the back of the classroom, be available, drink that much deserved tea, breathe deeply, and be available when they need you, because Lord knows you need a cup of tea more than anybody.
Yeah.
We're all
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's amazing. I'm sure, this is definitely one amazing, innovative way to push forward the dyslexic community and not and empower the non-dyslexic community, because that's really what matters, right? As well, is making sure we empower the people, regardless of them being dyslexic or not, to be able to be together and work together, right? And what's fascinating with dyslexia, because if you we've tried to approach this in a business way, and we were like, well, if let's say, there's a lot of different studies, but let's say there's around 20% of the world population with dyslexia, right? Let's say there's 20%, and when you look at the whole pyramid, right, from, let's say, government, big corporate, small businesses, school, non-for-profit, you've got this whole mix of what makes a modern society, and you can pick any box, and you can clearly make a positive argument for empowering this 20%, whether it's in the workplace. You want to have better team, you want to make sure that your people are well and are doing their job properly and have well-being at work. If you go to the government, you're like, a lot of people are most likely committing crime, often may have literacy problems, so that costs you. And you can pick any, whether it's the individual, the family, the community. And the question was like, well, if it's so obvious, for us, it was like, well, why? What's missing, right? And what we believe is, back to those two problems, which is assessing and supporting, sequential. Those two things are sequential, right? You have to be aware before being able to do anything. And it's the theory that we put forward, the case that we put forward is the accessibility to know, or the process and cost and everything you want involved to be able to know that a kid is likely to have dyslexia is absolutely not viable for large scale. And that means that you can't, it's really hard to know, right? It's just costs money. You're going to have to wait 6 months before having an appointment with an educational psychologist. And so what we hope is that we could make dyslexia more tangible. And I think that your noticeability is doing is actually giving the tool to the people saying, hey, you can use this to empower those dyslexic. And I think that's fantastic. And hopefully in a couple of years or month, we could see something great. But I think there's a lot of also people around the world who are working towards this. And I hope that with technology and connectivity and all this brand new digital world, we should be able to do a better job for dyslexic.
I think you nailed it. What I like, the trend that I like a lot, is there is a democratization of these tools so that parents who may get frustrated with schools can start to take action on their own. And time is of the essence for every single student with dyslexia because of that neuroplasticity that we're talking about. What you do is a fundamental component of that, right? That early detection. Now, the Orton Gillingham methodology of reading instruction is a very it's a nuanced and high level understanding of how to teach reading instruction. That is a bit of a it's a bit of a logjam because that is harder to scale because it's an individualized approach to the needs of a student with dyslexia. However, I trust somebody is going to figure out how to incorporate AI so that the OG process can be delivered to each individual student in an iterative and reactive way.
Mm.
On the other side, so those three components, detection, reading, remediation, and what noticeability does, there is no reason today that somebody listening to this can't go and become a homeschool deliverer of our curriculum. You don't have to be an educator. You got to sit through an hour and 15 minutes of our teacher training. You're ready to go. You find 3 students with dyslexia, your kid's 1, 2 of his buddies with dyslexia, approximately the same age, and you can start delivering this. So based on your work, and there are other organizations that are doing screening apps and detection and stuff. It's fantastic to see so many wonderful players coming into that space. And what we do, and then parents can take action right now, because I think one of the biggest frustrations, and frustration isn't the word, it's just downright pain that parents exhibit or express to us, is that they feel that their hands are tied because their schools aren't acting and they can't get their schools to understand this fast enough. And my answer is that we can do some things now. May not be everything, but we can do some things now. So, this is
absolutely,
we're not where we should be, but we're considerably further on the road from where we were. And we're putting, all of us collectively are focused on empowering the parent as well as the, and that's important.
Absolutely. Look, please do let me know when you come to Australia. I'll happily go to a bar with you and discuss all brain related deep topic. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great conversation. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people taking a lot of juice from this conversation and your experience and all of that. So thank you so much, Dean, for coming in, and I hope we can speak soon in Melbourne.
Well, I love it, and I have to give one shout out because we do have a bunch of Aussies who are taking our program. Check out the Book Twister, which is an invention created by 4 young dyslexics in Brisbane. It'll blow your mind. If you have any doubt as to why dyslexics are one of the most brilliant populations, the Book Twister will show you why. Love those little,
Amazing.
their beautiful accent. Hugo, thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for everybody for listening to this nauseating diatribe of me listening, outing out all of these ideas. But we're a big global tribe, and it's an honor to call you a dyslexic brother. I'll see you at Naughton's.
Sounds good, Dean. Thank you.
Cheers.